Welcome to E-MultiSkills video tutorial. In this video tutorial, we will learn how to configure MySQL master-slave replication on MySQL 8.0. So in this particular demo, the MySQL 8.0 is installed on RHEL. In fact, it is Oracle Enterprise Linux 6.5, and the IP address of master server is 192.168.1.51. The IP address of slave is 192.168.1.61, and the MySQL server, which is already installed, is 8.0. And let us first discuss about what is MySQL replication. So MySQL replication procedure enables you to automatically copy data from one MySQL database server to one or more MySQL database servers. So in this topology, there is one master, and the others which are receiving the changes from the master, they are known as the slave. So it can be one-to-one, masters to slave, or one-to-many, one master and there may be many slaves. So one server which acts as the master, and that is the one where all the updates are happening. So when we talk about master and slave replication in MySQL, the replication is asynchronous. And whatever the master sends, the updates, that is known as the events, which defines like what all modifications has happened in the database, it goes to the binary log. And the slave either it is one or many, that requests the events that are ready. That means whatever has changed on to the master database server in MySQL in terms of the events, that will be sent to the slave. So who is going to request those? Those are going to be requested by the slave. So it is in the asynchronous format. And why this is so good in terms of the MySQL, because you can keep your production environment, which is your master environment, just for the application purpose. The application can read, write, and do everything on one master server. And if you wanted to have more than one replica of your master, you can have the slaves created, and these slaves can be used for read scaling, and they can be used for the live database backups, DR. It can also be used as the DR, and that particular slave can be used for the analytical jobs as well. So there are a lot of replications which are supported by MySQL 8.0, but we are talking about the basic one, which is master to slave, and everything is based on the changes which are happening into the master database server, and it is captured into the binary log format. That binary log format, the binary log from master is sent to the slave, and all the changes which has already happened onto the master, they will be happening onto the slave. So the two things are required. One is the binary log file, and the other is the position. At what position do you want the slave to synchronize with the primary? So I'm already logged into the setup. So I'm logged into primary, which is my master server is 192.168.1.51, and the slave is 192.168.1.61, and MySQL 8.0 is already installed. Now what I have to do is I have to configure the master server. So to configure the master server, there are three important things. One is enabling the MySQL server to listen on the server's IP address. If it is in a particular IP address range, so there will be some IP address dedicated which cannot communicate with the outside world. So there will be a private IP address. So you have to make sure that you put the address of private IP in as bind variable. Then all these changes, whatever we are going to discuss, there are three changes. One is enabling the MySQL server to listen on the private IP. Second is setting a unique server ID, and then enabling the binary logging. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a backup of my what do you say, my.conf on primary master and the slave environment. So after that, on the primary environment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make the changes, the three important changes. So the three important changes are these ones. The first one is bind address. Bind address means when somebody is requesting the access, then at what IP address it has to access it. So this is the bind address. So we are going to bind it on the IP address of my master environment, and it is 192.168.1.51. Server ID in a master slave relationship, we give different server ID to master and the slave. It can be anything, but we are starting from 1, so server ID equal to 1 we are giving to master server. Logbin should be enabled. By default it is enabled in MySQL 8.0. if it is not enabled, and if you have disabled it, you have to make sure that it is enabled, otherwise it is not going to work. So the three important parameters we have added in my.conf. It is bind variable, which is the IP address of your server, that is master server. Server ID, which should be unique. In our case it is 1. You can keep any, but this number should be different for master and the slave. Then log -bin, this should be enabled, and by default already I have changed the location to some different location. It is MySQL/logs. Now let's save it and restart the MySQL server. So I'll just say service MySQL D restart. So whatever changes we have made on to the master server, they will be captured. So in the meantime, what I had done is I have opened the tail-10f of MySQL error log file so that you can see what is happening. So I have just restarted. So all the startup, shutdown, those things are being captured. So now you can see that server X plugin ready for connection. So the command has executed successfully onto the master server. Now what that was the step number 1. In the step number 2, what we will do, we will create a new replication user who can log in to the master server from the slave server. So let's perform the next step. So let's log into to MySQL server using MySQL-u root-p and provide the password. So I'm logged into the master server, and now what we have to do is we have to you can fire this command show master status -g. We have enabled 3 parameters, so that will show what is the status as of now. So you have to note down this. The important thing is the position and MySQL bin. So this is required because this you need to put in when you start the slave. So let me copy and paste this thing. Now we are going to create a replication user who can access MySQL server of master from slave server. So I'm just saying create username, @IP address of slave, identified with password. So I'm not going to use the new password authentication mechanism in 8.0. I'm going with the MySQL native password. So although it is not suggested, but this is a demo, so that's why we are using this. So I'm going to create the user. User is created. Once the user is created, you have to grant a replication on *** to the user. So the replication slave has been given all privileges. Now let's check the user is created or not. So you can see that a replica user has been created who can access it from the slave server, whose IP address is 192.168.1.61. The next step is let's try to log in to let's try to access the master server, MySQL master server, using the newly created user, and we are residing now on to the slave server. So I'll just say MySQL-u username hyphen at to which host name I wanted to connect. I wanted to connect to the IP address of source, master I, and hyphen p is the password. And just feed in the password. Password is password at 123. I'm able to log in, so everything is fine. So testing is successful. Now, next step is we will configure the slave server. We have to make some changes. Again, the three important changes, which are like bind address of slave, server ID, which should be unique, and log bin that should be enabled. By default, it is enabled in MySQL 8.0. So let's perform the other steps. So I'm putting everything near to log underscore bin, so that all the three important points which we are going to enable, that should be at the same position. So bind address and server hyphen ID we are keeping together. So we have three entries which we should enable: bind address, server ID, and log bin. Just save, exit, and restart it. So we'll just say service MySQL D restart, and we have done the tail minus 10f of slash var log slash mysql.d. So you can see that server is going down, and then it will come up. It is MySQL server which is going down and coming up. Now it is X plugin ready for connection. That means the execution has completed. Now the next step is configure the parameter for slave server to connect to the master server. So what we have to do is we have to perform this on slave server. We have to tell where is the master server details from the command prompt. So we'll say stop slave if it has started. Change master to master host. This is the IP address of the host. Master user, which is used for replication, is replica. Master password we have to provide, and master log file. This is something which you had captured in the first step. So it is MySQL bin dot 4 times 023, and position is 155, which we had captured. So it is 155 MySQL bin 0023. Let's see. Yes. So position and this thing. Now from the command prompt of slave, let's execute this. We are going to execute stop slave. So that is done. Now change master to this all statement we will execute in a single go. Let us see the error log file. So you can see there are some statements which has executed. So there is no error. Now the next step is let's start the slave and check the status of the slave. Start slave, you can check the error log file as well. There is no problem. We'll check the status of the slave. So we have to scroll up to the output. So it is saying waiting for master to send events. This is the master host, user ID, and this is the log bin. Slave IO running, yes. Slave SQL running, yes. So everything is fine from the slave side. Now let's check the same for master as well. So we'll say show master status G. Oh, I have came out of this prompt, so let me log in again to MySQL prompt. Show master, so you can see everything is fine. And now we have to perform a testing. So just say show database and we'll create a new database and table, and same should, there are 7 tables onto the source side, that is master database server. Execute the same on to the slave database server. Just say show databases. So there are 7 databases. Now let's create a database and a table onto the source side, that is master side. So we'll say create database test replica. So this is, you can check the error log as well. So it is going to write some information onto the source and to the master and the slave side. Now let's create the table as well onto the source side, that is master server side, and we will validate the same on slave environment. So I have not selected the database, so let's say use test replica, and then we will create a table onto the master side. This is done. Let us see if there is any error in the mysql d.log. So there is no error. Let's do one more thing. Go to the slave side and just say show databases. Earlier there were 7 databases, so it should have one more database, that is test replica. Just say use test replica, and we will see if the table creation has completed over here or not. We'll say show tables. So you can say the departments table is created. So onto the master side, you can just say use test replica, and you just say show tables, which we have created. So you can see that. You can say departments we created onto the source side, and it has replicated onto the slave side. So this is an example of how does the master slave replication works in MySQL. This is very, very simple. So let's recap what we had done. So we understood like what is master slave relationship or replication on MySQL 8.0. So there is a master server wherein all the changes which are happening that are captured in binary log format, and that binary log is shipped to the slave side, and when it applies it, the transactions come onto the slave side. The replication is asynchronous in type, so that it is not real time. So that is fine. And in our setup, what we had done is there is a master server, there is a slave, only one. So IP address was 192.168.51 and the slave was 61. The MySQL was already installed, and in the first step what we did is we added 3 parameters in my.conf. So that was bind address, second was server ID, and third was logbin. By default, logbin is enabled, binary log is enabled in MySQL 8.0. So you just have to enable these 2 parameters, server -id equal to 1. That should be unique in master and slave relationship. And once these were done, we restarted the server, then we checked the status of master. From the command prompt, we just said show master status -g. So this will show the position where it is currently positioning. So you have to note this, and the file name. And then we are going to what we did is we created a user, and then we granted the replication slave, and then we tested if we are able to access the master server from the slave host. So that was working fine. Then we configured the slave server, again 3 parameters, bind address, server ID, and logbin. and finally onto the slave side we executed from the command prompt, MySQL command prompt, stopped the slave. It was already, if it was already started, then we changed master to the, we mentioned the IP address of master host, then we mentioned the master user, then master password, then master log file which was created in show status master, and then we mentioned the master log position. Once everything was done, we started the slave and we checked the status of slave. It should be up and running, so that was fine. And finally, for the testing, we created a database and created a table onto the uh, uh, onto the master side, and the same was replicated onto the slave side. So this is a very simple and convenient way of setting up a master slave replication in MySQL. It is just 3 parameters and just few statements which you have to run. So the setup is very simple. I hope this is going to help, and thanks.